Hey guys, tonight we're going to the Victorian seaside. Not for thrills, not for speedboats, not even for sunbathing, really. No, you're headed back to a gentler time, when swimming involved wooden huts on wheels, when modesty was a full-time job, and when sea air was considered an all-purpose cure, even for heartbreak. You're standing at the edge of a pebbled beach, watching as stiff hats wobble in the wind and parasols bloom like pastel flowers. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brays in protest, possibly because it knows what's coming. You're about to enter the peculiar world of the Victorian sea bathing machine, a contraption so strangely elegant and unintentionally comedic that it deserves its own bedtime story. Of course, you probably won't survive this experience in modern swimwear. A Victorian beach would recoil at the sight of your ankles, never mind your Speedo. But don't worry, we'll wrap you in flannel, tuck in your morals, and lower you into the water with as little dignity as possible. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a gravel path lined with neat rows of striped tents and temporary tea shacks. All around, families bustle with folding chairs and questionable picnic baskets. You catch whiffs of boiled eggs, seaweed, and the unmistakable scent of damp tweed. Somewhere ahead, gulls scream like tiny seaside banshees, which somehow only adds to the atmosphere. The year is 1887. Queen Victoria is in her golden jubilee year, and every town with access to salt water is desperately advertising its healthful coast. You've come to one such spot, a tidy little resort town perched on the edge of the English Channel, where the tide is only marginally less judgmental than the local vicar. People are everywhere. Toddlers dig earnest holes with tin shovels, their mothers perched nearby on striped wooden deck chairs that look like they'd fold under a strong breeze. Older couples promenade with gravity-defying posture, and here and there, you spot the quiet dread of city folk realizing they've forgotten how to relax. Your shoes crunch over shells and cigarette ends as you step onto the wet, packed sand. Out at sea, a few brave heads bob in the water. Well, not exactly in public view. Because even now, in the golden glow of afternoon, privacy is the order of the day. And that's when you see it. Your first sea bathing machine. At first glance, it looks like a tool shed that's wandered onto the beach by accident. Made of heavy, pale-painted wood, it sits on 4 wide wheels, designed to roll down the beach, ideally without collapsing or panicking nearby livestock. A tiny chimney pokes out of the roof, releasing the faintest puff of smoke. Someone's brought a portable kettle. Civilized. It has a door at the back and a curtain at the front. No windows, of course. What would people think? You approach slowly, like one might approach an eccentric relative's backyard invention. The machine stands about 8 feet tall, though it's been described in Victorian brochures with such phrases as delightfully intimate, and just the thing for the discreet bather. It's attached to a pair of ropes, one of which leads to a horse that appears to be contemplating unionizing. As you circle the machine, you can't help but marvel at the simplicity and the absurdity. Victorian beachgoers would climb into the little cabin fully clothed, shut the door, and change into their bathing costume. Then, once appropriately and modestly attired, the entire machine would be dragged into the sea by horse or, occasionally, sheer manpower. Only once it was fully afloat, or at least in water deep enough to conceal scandalous shins, could the bather exit through the front curtain and descend into the waves. It's like reverse stage magic. You enter in full dress, vanish for a moment, and emerge, still scandalized, but wet. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of the machine was health, modesty, or just a charming excuse to buy seaside real estate. One popular theory claims that Queen Victoria herself used a bathing machine at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and as with all things royal, this lent the device a sort of moral authority it probably didn't deserve. Of course, she had her machine wheeled directly into a quiet cove, complete with curtains, attendants, and no witnesses. Modesty, after all, was a team sport. You pass by a young man standing near another machine, hands clasped behind his back in quiet admiration, or possibly bafflement. He tips his bowler hat at you, a silent acknowledgement of your shared confusion. First time? He asks. You nod. Don't worry, he adds with a wink, it only feels ridiculous until you're halfway to France. Nearby, a boy kicks over a sandcastle shaped vaguely like a cathedral. His sister screams, his mother sighs, and a seagull swoops down to steal an unattended sandwich. Truly, it's the golden age of seaside serenity. As the sun dips lower, the bathing machines begin their slow pilgrimage toward the water's edge. Horses strain. Wheels creak. Somewhere in the distance, someone drops a teacup and mutters something you're glad the wind carries away. One machine bumps over a hidden ridge in the sand and tips slightly, prompting a panic yelp from within. All part of the charm. And you? You're next. You step toward the water's edge, but it isn't the ocean that catches your attention first. It's the enormous wooden box on wheels sitting just where the sand turns to wet. A bit like a shed, a bit like a tiny house that forgot to finish growing, and a bit like something you're fairly certain was designed by someone deeply committed to personal privacy. There are curtains. There is a small set of steps. There are, somehow, both windows and absolutely no visibility. This is your introduction to the Victorian sea bathing machine. Now, machine may be a generous term. If you're expecting levers, gears, or even a well-oiled pulley system, think again. What you get instead is a glorified changing hut on cart wheels, occasionally hauled in and out of the surf by an overworked horse or, if you're especially fortunate, a very tired human with a rope. It's charming, in the way that medical leeches or candlelit dental surgery is charming, best enjoyed in hindsight, with no personal involvement. Still, the design is not without its logic. This curious contraption exists because you, a proper Victorian gentle person, cannot simply disrobe or expose any portion of your leg, even a humble calf, to the open world. The very idea would prompt fainting spells from ladies on the promenade and possibly collapse a minor duchy. And so, the sea bathing machine is born, a portable fortress of modesty. You open the creaky door and step inside. It smells of salt, damp wood, and optimism. There's a bench for sitting, a hook for hanging your bathing gown, which resembles a small tent, and curiously, a tiny window with a lace curtain that serves no function other than to reassure you that yes, you are indeed inside a socially sanctioned rectangle. From the outside, it's just another machine, lining the beach like obedient little snails. But from within, it's a world between worlds. You're not fully dressed, not quite swimming, and certainly not naked, heavens no. You're simply preparing. This is liminal Victorian territory, and you must treat it with all the seriousness of a handshake between monarchs. Once you've changed, you give a discreet knock to signal readiness. Outside, someone, either a strapping youth or an exceptionally strong-willed donkey, begins pulling the machine seaward. You sway slightly as the wheels bump along sand, seaweed, and occasional crabs. A small porthole lets you glimpse the glimmering waves ahead. This is progress, in the grand British tradition, uncomfortable, weather-dependent, and deeply committed to avoiding scandal. Historians still argue whether these machines were truly about modesty or whether they masked a more complex cocktail of class control, gender policing, and seaside economics. After all, only those with time, servants, and a change of linen could indulge in such a precisely choreographed ritual. The working class had a simpler method: find a quiet spot and jump in before anyone noticed your knees. As you rattle down the beach in your wooden cubicle, the sound of gulls fills the air, half mournful, half amused. Somewhere, a gentleman drops his monocle trying to glimpse a lady's silhouette through the curtains. Don't worry, he's politely escorted away by a constable wielding a very authoritative mustache. The machine stops. You've reached the modest zone, about waist deep in water, far enough that no one can see what you're doing, close enough that if you scream, a dipper might still rescue you. The back doors swing open, and there it is, the sea, cool and green and waiting. You hesitate. The water sparkles invitingly, but you are, let's remember, dressed in approximately 3 layers of flannel, bloomers, and something called a modesty bodice, which seems to be more about weight than coverage. Still, you gather your courage, and your skirts, and step delicately into the waves. The sensation is bracing, which is a polite way of saying cold enough to restart a stopped heart. Your feet sink into the sand, the salt stings slightly, and somewhere nearby, a dipper applauds your bravery while offering a steadying hand and possibly a light push. This is sea bathing, Victorian style, less a recreational swim, more a quiet negotiation between your will to live and society's fear of ankles. And yet there's something serene about it. The sky above is a perfect pale blue, the sea breeze carries a touch of lavender from the bather's cologne, and the waves slap against the machine's side like the slow applause of a very refined audience. You wade about, never straying far from the rope tied to the machine's rear axle. That rope, you sense, is as much psychological as practical, linking you to safety, to propriety, to land. Every so often, you catch a glimpse of another bather, a woman in stripes, a man adjusting his cap with great formality, a child in a sailor's suit being forcibly removed from a jellyfish. You wonder briefly how this will be remembered. Will future generations think it quaint? Silly? Endearing? Or will they marvel that an entire industry sprang up to help people avoid being seen while possibly touching water? One thing's certain, you've now bathed at the seaside in the most correct, upright, socially approved way possible. And you've done it inside a wooden box that looks a bit like a fruit stand and smells faintly of wet wool. Progress. You're barely settled in your bathing machine when the reality of why it exists starts to soak in, pun intended. The sea sparkles just a few yards away, the gulls wheel overhead like they own the place, and there you are, enclosed in a wooden shed on wheels, all because showing a little ankle in public might shatter society's delicate moral framework. Victorian Britain, you soon realize, was a swirling storm of repression cloaked in velvet and lace. This was the age of Queen Victoria herself, who reportedly had such a strong distaste for public immodesty that the mere idea of men and women sharing a beach sent entire parishes into fits of communal pearl-clutching. So, naturally, the answer was to invent a kind of mobile modesty chamber, your very own seaside confessional, sans priest, plus wet socks. Bathing machines weren't just a charming eccentricity, they were a full-blown social compromise. The public wanted the benefits of sea air, salt water, and being gently knocked over by waves, but without the scandal of public undressing. These wheeled huts rolled down to the water's edge, so you could slip into the ocean discreetly, like a seal with a strong sense of shame. Historians still argue whether they were originally devised as a health measure or a moral bandage, but either way, they caught on fast. You peek out the slatted shutters of your machine and notice that each gender has a designated section of the beach. Ropes or fences might separate them, or, on some stricter shores, guards, actual humans employed to prevent visual mingling. It's like gym class, but damp and 30% more judgmental. What's fascinating, and admittedly a bit hilarious, is that this obsession with propriety didn't necessarily translate to better bathing suits. Victorian swimwear resembled floating upholstery. Women wore flannel dresses weighted at the hems to prevent any accidental Marilyn Monroe moments, while men opted for heavy woolen onesies that sagged dramatically when wet. The result? Everyone was drowning in dignity. And here's the twist. While society was panicking over exposed calves, it simultaneously encouraged beach visits for health. Doctors were prescribing saltwater dips for ailments ranging from melancholia to digestive distress. You couldn't see your neighbor's knees, but you were absolutely supposed to dunk yourself in the same water that 200 others had already gently marinated in. Medicine's a funny thing. As you sit back, the walls of the bathing machine creak softly, and you realize this contraption is more than just a quirky tool for entering water. It's a microcosm of Victorian values, practical, prudish, and deeply theatrical. The fact that so much engineering went into ensuring no one glimpsed a damp forearm is a testament to just how seriously modesty was taken. You begin to wonder if Victorians had nightmares about accidentally making eye contact with a bare shoulder. There's also the matter of who got to use the bathing machines. Wealthier families could rent them for extended periods, sometimes days at a time, while the working class, assuming they had leisure time at all, might be herded into communal versions with far less privacy. Even in the realm of concealment, social hierarchies found a way to peep through. You reach out and touch the inside panel of your machine. The wood is painted a cheerful blue, worn down by years of salt air and sandy hands. On the back wall, a metal hook holds an impressively modest bathing robe. You suspect it weighs about as much as a wet spaniel. There's a faint scent of lavender soap and mildew, and outside, the clip-clop of horses pulling another machine into the waves reminds you that these contraptions didn't just appear at the shoreline by magic. They were hauled there, sometimes by donkeys, sometimes by attendants, and occasionally by sheer British willpower. It occurs to you that the whole operation required a small village's worth of coordination: drivers, dippers, dressers, and attendants all working together to ensure nobody accidentally saw someone's elbow. It's like a very slow, very soggy ballet. And still, despite all the rigmarole, people loved it. They came in droves to the seaside, lured by the promise of healthy lungs, fresher complexions, and the faintly erotic thrill of standing waist-deep in water while wearing 17 layers of linen. Of course, not everyone was convinced this was entirely necessary. Satirists of the time had a field day. Political cartoons depicted men and women waddling around in absurd swimwear, while newspapers questioned whether hiding behind a curtain really did anything to protect one's soul. Yet public pressure kept the bathing machine industry thriving well into the early 20th century. You lean back, letting your head rest against the paneled wall. Somewhere in the distance, a vendor calls out about hot winkles and treacle toffee. The ocean murmurs like a disapproving ant, and the entire ridiculous, wonderful enterprise rolls steadily on. You can't help but chuckle softly, because you're about to bathe in the sea, without a single person seeing a thing, except the fish. You clamber up into the sea bathing machine, your own little wooden carriage of coastal decorum. The moment you step inside, a faint creak of the floorboards greets your weight, and you're struck by the curious intimacy of this mobile shed. It's not quite a room, not quite a wagon, and definitely not designed with elbow room in mind. A tiny window lets in a sliver of daylight, illuminating the thick bathing costume hanging neatly from a peg, its fabric heavy enough to make a sailor weep. Your feet shuffle over the sand-covered wooden floor. Outside, the wheels of your bathing machine, massive and purposefully chunky, begin to shift. The whole contraption lurches forward, and you instinctively reach out to the walls for support. Through the window, you spot the source of this movement, a very determined horse, led by an even more determined woman with forearms like nautical rope. This, you've learned, is the standard operating procedure. A horse, or in some towns too if your machine has delusions of grandeur, hauls your quaint little box out into the surf. The goal is simple: to get you far enough from the peering eyes of landlubbers so you can slip discreetly into the water, your dignity and bloomers intact. Of course, nothing in the Victorian seaside world is ever that simple. Inside, there's a small wooden bench, a rough hook for clothing, and a handle on the door that leads to the water side, currently bolted. The other door, the shore door, is now closed. You're encased in this box like a very polite sandwich. Your bathing attendant, or dipper, as the coastal locals affectionately and somewhat fearfully call her, knocks briskly. She calls out that you should now disrobe and prepare. You obey, though the process takes a while, not least because your bathing costume seems to have been designed for both modesty and low-grade resistance training. Once changed, you're ready for your moment. The door facing the sea creaks open, and you glimpse the waves rolling gently below. There's a canvas curtain, thoughtfully installed, to shield you from the public's prying gaze. The machine is parked just deep enough for the sea to lap at its base, giving the illusion that you've simply materialized in the water, fully dressed, of course, like a damp sea apparition. Now comes the truly Victorian bit. You're expected to hold onto a rope, or sometimes a primitive wooden handrail, and lower yourself into the sea. That's right, graceful diving is frowned upon. There are no steps, no ladders, just your own determination and, if needed, the sturdy arms of the dipper to assist you in descending into the bracing water. Historians still argue whether this process was more about bathing or about publicly signaling moral superiority. One scholar described the entire ordeal as a ritual of damp virtue, while another bluntly called it an exercise in suppressing human nature with curtains and horse carts. You wade slowly into the water, the weight of your costume dragging behind you like a reluctant pet. The temperature hits you like a bucket of well-mannered ice. The dipper, observing your hesitation, gives a gentle yet undeniable shove to your shoulder. And so you're in. The sensation is shocking, then strangely invigorating. Cold tendrils of seawater creep up your spine, but you adjust quickly. The salt clings to your skin, and the rhythmic push of waves against your limbs has a hypnotic quality, soothing, despite everything. The curtain flaps gently above your head, and the bathing machine stands behind you like a loyal sentry, shielding your flailing from public judgment. You float a little, bobbing up and down. Around you, other machines are lined up like obedient soldiers of modesty. From beneath one curtain, a small foot kicks playfully. From another, a hand flails upward, possibly requesting tea. All the while, the dippers keep a watchful eye. It is their sacred duty to prevent both indecency and drowning, preferably in that order. One fringe tidbit: in the more elite resorts, you could pay extra for a machine with upholstery, which meant slightly padded benches and allegedly velvet wall hangings, because nothing says luxury like damp velvet on a foggy coast. As you continue your aquatic adventure, the dipper calls out that your allotted time is almost up. Sea bathing, you see, was meant to be brief, just long enough to receive the healthful shock but not so long that you began to enjoy yourself too freely. With reluctant limbs and mild goosebumps, you paddle back toward the bathing machine. The dipper helps you in, and you wrap yourself in a thick towel, smelling faintly of lavender and mildew. The shore door swings open again, and the horse resumes its patient trudge, dragging you, still dripping, back to land. You sit in the wobbling box, salt on your cheeks, hair plastered to your forehead, and a creeping awareness that no part of you feels either clean or dry. Yet, strangely, you feel accomplished. You've braved the sea, upheld modesty, and earned the right to lie dramatically on a deck chair while sipping tepid lemonade. And you didn't fall over. Much. You're not even knee-deep in salt water before someone hands you a pamphlet on the dangers of moral decay by shoreline. Welcome to the Victorian Seaside, where every splash is viewed with suspicion and the question of whether your toes are corrupting society is asked with complete seriousness. The year might be 1854, but according to the local clergy, sin rides the waves just as easily as surfboards would, had they existed yet. As you tread cautiously, you begin to realize that sea bathing, despite its health claims, was never just about hygiene or healing. It was a tightly wound knot of morality, medicine, and modesty, all wrapped up in several layers of flannel and fear. For many Victorians, the ocean offered a paradox. It was a holy tonic and a scandalous temptation. The idea that men and women might frolic together in brine, wearing wet fabric that, brace yourself, clung slightly to their figures. Positively alarming. Clergymen, especially in smaller seaside towns, led the charge against what they termed aquatic impropriety. Sermons were peppered with pointed remarks about the dangers of shared beaches and co-ed splashing. In some cases, entire congregations were encouraged to shun bathing altogether unless it was under strictly controlled, gender-separated conditions. Your slightly ridiculous bathing machine? It's not just a changing stall on wheels, it's a moral barricade, a fortress against the rising tide of temptation. Historians still argue whether the fervor for modesty was driven more by religious zeal, social pressure, or simply a deeply British fear of someone, somewhere, enjoying themselves. Whatever the cause, the result was a complex dance of sand, shame, and sea foam. Entire beach zones were marked out with signs dictating who could bathe, when, and under which lunar phases, presumably. And it wasn't just about what you wore, but how you wore it. A woman seen emerging from the water with hair unpinned was liable to cause an entire bandstand to faint. Men, meanwhile, were expected to bathe in long, woolen tunics that reached mid-thigh or lower. The legs, after all, were the gateway to disgrace. You attempt to follow the rules, even as they shift beneath your feet like wet pebbles. There's a specific time slot for ladies, and an even more specific time slot for ladies of advanced sensibility, which appears to mean those who swoon easily at the sight of collarbones. One local newspaper warns of a recent incident involving a gentleman who removed his hat before leaving his bathing machine. the horror. Still, there's something oddly theatrical about it all. At any given moment you might spot a clergyman standing just beyond the promenade with a small spyglass, ensuring no one is attempting anything unseemly, like joy. Some towns even hired modesty inspectors, yes, that was an actual job title, to enforce propriety at the beach. Their toolkit included a whistle, a pair of binoculars, and what must have been an incredibly tedious report form. Oddly enough, there were fringe voices even then who questioned the logic of it all. Early feminists, often caricatured as shrill troublemakers in the press, argued that restricting women's mobility and comfort in the name of propriety was a societal own goal. One pamphlet from 1872 pointed out, quite reasonably, that men drowning from heavy wool swimsuits was a far greater public danger than a fleeting glimpse of knee. Still, the cultural tides were slow to shift. For now, you are advised to plunge briskly, remain modestly submerged, and exit with haste and lowered eyes. You try this. You fail spectacularly. Your hair is wind-whipped, your flannel suit weighs approximately the same as a grand piano, and a curious seagull seems to think your bonnet is nesting material. And yet, there's a kind of odd charm to it. The excessive rules, the dramatic posturing, the sense that your every move is being scrutinized not for safety but for sanctity. It's all part of the Victorian experience. You're not just bathing. You're participating in a moral ballet choreographed by society and enforced by a very determined widow with a parasol. Your dip concludes with a shiver and a squeak of the bathing machine's ancient wheels as your attendant, Mrs. Danvers, hauls you back to shore like the catch of the day. You wrap yourself in a towel the size of a picnic blanket and are handed yet another pamphlet, this one reminding you that laughter above a certain volume may be misconstrued as flirtation. As you sit in your beach chair, sipping lukewarm tea from a tin mug and watching a child attempt to build a sandcastle that looks suspiciously like a Gothic cathedral, you can't help but admire the sheer effort involved. All this to touch water. Still, it makes a kind of sense. If you believed the sea could cure melancholia and possibly syphilis, it stood to reason that it could also seduce. The ocean, in the Victorian mind, was both medicine and menace, something to approach with reverence, corsetry, and a stern moral compass. You sigh, stretch out your aching limbs, and glance again at the tide. It looks suspiciously inviting. Maybe tomorrow you'll bathe again. But this time, you'll blink slowly at the modesty inspector just to see what happens. You meet her at dawn, just as the mist from the sea is curling like a lazy cat across the sand. She stands by your bathing machine with her hands on her hips, a look that could curdle milk and motivate a ship to turn back to port. She is your dipper, and no, it's not a condiment, though one might argue she brings a similar zing to the whole experience. She's built like someone who can carry barrels, children, and grudges, and her name is either Maud or possibly Beryl, though she tells you, just call me Dip. You decide not to ask for clarification. Dip's job, in the most gloriously Victorian turn of logic, is to launch you into the ocean. Not accompany. Not guide. No. Launch. You are cargo. She is both crane and catapult. Victorian dippers, always women, always local, always indomitable, held a revered and slightly feared status along the shoreline. Most were former fisherwomen or laborers who knew the sea better than most of the gentry bobbing about in lace and ribbon. These women operated the bathing machines, managed their riders, you, in this unfortunate case, and ensured no one drowned from excessive modesty or parasol-based injuries. As you step into the small wooden box on wheels, Dip follows with a brusque arms up. Before you can protest, she tugs your bathing costume into place with the precision of a tent rigger. Your bathing attire, if it can be called that, includes bloomers, a tunic, a cap, and a sash. All of it heavy. All of it damp before you even reach the water, thanks to a sea mist that seems personally offended by your dryness. With your costume set and modesty at a militant maximum, Dip signals the donkey. Yes, the donkey. Most machines in this era were pulled into the sea by horse or donkey, an animal whose understanding of tides was, at best, anecdotal. The beast looks at you with resigned judgment, then begins pulling. The machine creaks. The wheels shudder. You rattle forward like a privileged box of tea leaves. Now, historians still argue whether dippers were purely utilitarian or part of an early form of coastal performance art. Some accounts suggest dippers offered advice on posture, breathing, and the correct angle at which to scream upon entering cold water. Others say they simply heaved people in with a gruff and ego, and hoped for the best. Dip seems to fall in the latter category. Once the machine is at full submersion, just enough so that your ankles feel personally attacked by the Atlantic, you open the curtain. The salty wind slaps your face. The waves mutter things that sound like regrets. Dip wades around to the back, boots squelching, and offers you a hand. It is not a hand one refuses. "Ready?" she asks, without waiting. Then it happens. There is no ceremony. No gentle transition. With all the delicacy of a rogue bowling ball, she propels you into the sea. Your scream is not dignified. Your entry is not elegant. You are underwater in a moment, floundering in full costume, the ribbon of your bathing cap slapping you across the face in rhythmic protest. And yet, somehow, you float. Sort of. Dip nods approvingly from the shore, arms crossed, as if to say, "See? Told you it was refreshing." And it is, in a way. Once the icy shock settles into something like awareness, you feel oddly peaceful. The waves bob you gently, your clothes heavy but holding you afloat like a damply affectionate hug. Above all else, the dippers were safety officers. Their sharp eyes scanned the waters for trouble, and their voices, oh, their voices, could summon children from dunes and shame gentlemen out of their late morning swims. They also enforced the strict, rotating bathing schedules, ladies in the morning, gentlemen after, and anyone attempting a romantic overlap was swiftly scolded with a full-volume "Sir." One recorded dipper, a Mrs. Flossie Gibbons of Margate, reportedly saved over 30 swimmers in her time and once wrestled a beached mackerel back into the sea using a parasol. Another, known simply as Big Elsie, was rumored to tow 2 machines simultaneously during peak hours and could quote psalms while dunking. Dip waits until you've had your fill of drifting, which, due to your teeth chattering like castanets, takes about 5 minutes, and then gestures you back to the machine. You clamber in, dripping and humbled, and she helps you out of the sea with a surprising tenderness. The interior smells faintly of lavender and salt. As the donkey begins pulling the contraption back to shore, you sit in the cabin and wonder how anyone ever found this restful. And yet, oddly, it is. The rhythmic creak of the wheels, the hush of waves retreating from your ankles, the vague sense of having survived something ancient and absurd, it's oddly soothing. Dip waits with a thick towel and a curt nod. You thank her. She squints at you and says you didn't scream too much. High praise. You've just emerged from your dunking, courtesy of a rather enthusiastic dipper who clearly missed her calling as a competitive shot putter, and now you find yourself standing, dripping, shivering, and gloriously bewildered, on the pebbled edge of the Victorian shoreline. But this is no time to dry off and return to your rented deck chair. No, no. The hour is about to strike. Gentleman's hour. If you thought women's modesty was tightly policed, wait until you witness the intense scrutiny surrounding male bathing attire during the 19th century. The Victorians had a unique flair for turning even the gentlest aquatic hobby into a grand moral conundrum, and the question of what men could, and should, wear while bathing was debated with all the fervor of a parliamentary session, only damper. Gentlemen were typically allocated separate time slots on the beach, often early morning or late evening, so that their scandalously unclad torsos wouldn't cause a mass swooning of the faint-hearted ladies nearby. In theory, these hours provided space for energetic plunges, vigorous swimming strokes, and perhaps a discreet show of calf. In practice, they often devolved into awkward waddles in damp wool, and the occasional cold shock that made certain bits of anatomy temporarily retract into the safety of Victorian repression. You watch as several men shuffle toward the surf, their bathing costumes clinging with the damp desperation of a wet dish rag. The most common male attire of the period? The woolen bathing suit, sometimes striped, often itchy, and frequently shrinking in unpredictable ways. Some featured short sleeves and knee-length legs, offering just enough coverage to protect society from the moral perils of exposed kneecaps. Others looked like tragic circus uniforms that had lost the fight with the laundry mangle. Historians still argue whether these bathing suits were genuinely designed for modesty, or if they were simply the result of someone having far too much leftover wool and not enough ventilation. Either way, the result was something that both chafed and sagged, a rare feat in clothing design. Some brave, or perhaps merely confused, souls opted for the controversial drawers-only approach. These bathing drawers, a sort of woolen undergarment worn as outerwear, sparked immediate uproar among the more delicate beachgoers. Letters to seaside town newspapers decried the practice as barbarous, unsightly, and absolutely French, which, for a Victorian Brit, was the height of condemnation. One anonymous matron described an encounter with a man in bathing drawers as viscerally alarming, as though one had caught a glimpse of one's footman shaving. To avoid impropriety, or at least complaints to the local vicar, many beaches enforced a strict bathing costume code. In some towns, beach constables patrolled the sands with the solemn authority of moral lifeguards, issuing firm warnings to any gentleman who dared show an unclothed shoulder. You imagine them wielding citation cards and umbrellas, wagging fingers as they mutter about the decline of decency and the perils of perspiration. Of course, bathing machines still played a role in men's aquatic adventures, but with a slightly different rhythm. Whereas ladies were carefully wheeled into the surf with all the ceremonial grace of a royal barge launch, men often shoved their machines into place themselves, jumping out with a kind of chaotic enthusiasm that suggests they hadn't read the instruction manual. Some even dispensed with machines entirely, marching down the beach barefoot and belligerent, trailing damp mustaches and carrying a confidence that could only come from never having seen one's reflection in wet wool. You catch a glimpse of one such gentleman now, a burly chap with an alarmingly red chest and the kind of sideburns that double as windbreaks. He plunges into the surf with all the grace of a sack of potatoes, emerges coughing seawater, and lets out a triumphant whoop that scares at least 2 seagulls and possibly 1 small child. But it wasn't all chaos and near nudity. Some resorts offered more structured options for gentlemen. Certain high-end beaches provided private dressing tents, manservants, and even heated seawater baths piped directly into enclosed pavilions. This allowed for the illusion of rugged sea healthiness without the inconvenience of, waves. Still, not everyone approved of men bathing at all. Some social critics argued that it made them too vigorous, too rowdy, perhaps even too full of themselves. Others claimed it was an unnecessary distraction from serious gentlemanly pursuits like reading newspapers, inspecting clocks, or adjusting monocles with pointed disdain. But perhaps the greatest peril of men's beach hours wasn't the immodesty or the rowdiness. It was the terrible, inevitable moment when a wet wool suit clung so tightly that it turned a confident stroll into a crab-like shuffle of pure regret. Entire novels could be written about the faces of men trying to reclaim dignity while waddling back up the beach in clinging gray stripes. And just as you're marveling at this elaborate aquatic ballet of decency, discomfort, and deeply unfortunate tailoring, the tide starts to turn. The men shuffle back into their machines, or wrap themselves in voluminous towels and stagger toward the dunes. It's time to reallocate the sand once again. Up next, the women's turn. And if you thought the male bathing suit was impractical, wait until you see what happens when 14 pounds of ribbon and moral fortitude go swimming together. You are now swaddled in a bathing costume that feels more like formal evening wear than anything intended for aquatic activity. It clings in all the wrong places, billows in others, and weighs approximately the same as a small terrier, when dry. You haven't even stepped into the water yet. This is Victorian women's beach fashion in its full, impractical glory. A bathing dress, typically made of heavy wool, perhaps serge if you're lucky, drapes from neck to shin. It's often navy blue, sometimes trimmed in white or red for a nautical flair that, frankly, fools no one. You're also wearing bloomers, voluminous ones, underneath. They're cinched at the ankle to keep modesty intact, even if dignity starts to slip. To top off the ensemble, you've got a bathing cap. Not the stretchy, rubbery kind you might expect, but rather a bonnet, sometimes straw, sometimes fabric, tied firmly under your chin, with all the charm of a lampshade in a high wind. And yet, here you are, wobbling across the wet sand in little lace-up boots, flanked by other women in matching seafaring shackles. No one is actually swimming, you notice. They're dipping, paddling, gently crouching in the shallows like regretful ducks. There's a shared understanding that getting one's head wet is uncivilized at best, and a probable death sentence at worst. Historians still argue whether Victorian women's bathing fashion was more about protecting modesty or simply a reflection of the era's relentless enthusiasm for discomfort. One theory suggests that the outfits were designed to weigh women down on purpose, to discourage too much freedom of movement, and certainly to prevent anything resembling sport. You squint toward the men's side of the beach, which, despite being cordoned off by a line of heroic canvas screens, is clearly a realm of less suffering. The men are bare-kneed, bare-armed, and positively indecent by comparison. Their woolen suits are simpler, still full coverage, but they don't seem to come with built-in drowning risks. Back on your side, a woman is attempting to wade deeper, but her petticoat balloons like a jellyfish and she's quickly grounded by her own outfit. Another is valiantly trying to jump a wave, only for her bonnet to fly off midair. You spot a dipper, a professional woman employed to help bathers into the sea, rushing over with a spare cap and the kind of calm efficiency one reserves for runaway livestock. In this moment, you realize just how performative Victorian sea bathing truly was. It wasn't about swimming. It was about being seen briefly, and properly, participating in the ritual. A genteel woman of society was expected to bathe, yes, but not to enjoy it too visibly. Excessive splashing suggested emotional instability. Floating unaccompanied? Downright unseemly. And wading out alone past waist depth? Why, you probably wouldn't survive that. The weight of the wool begins to settle in as you wade ankle deep. Each step makes a wet squelch, your boots threatening mutiny with every soggy shift. The waves lap impolitely, but the cold has sharp teeth. You begin to suspect this is the Victorian version of an ice bucket challenge, except there's no audience to applaud your bravery, only a seagull judging your bonnet. Still, there's something oddly lovely about it. The sea glints in the afternoon sun. The air smells of salt and distant toffee. Somewhere, a brass band plays a polite waltz, muffled by distance and sea breeze. The sky is painted in washed-out pastels, and your fellow bathers are giggling in hushed tones that match the era's approved decibel level. You feel a sudden tug at your hem, just seaweed, but you do a convincing impression of someone being dragged into the abyss. It's fine. No one saw. Except perhaps the dipper, who raises a single eyebrow and goes back to steadying another bather as she topples sideways like a corseted tree. And that's the quiet charm of it, in a way. Victorian women weren't expected to swim laps or dive. They weren't even really expected to move. Just to bob respectfully in the shallows, smile when spoken to, and emerge without having scandalized anyone's monocle. Still, some women rebelled. Slowly. Quietly. There are records of custom-made, lighter bathing costumes sewn in secret. Whispered rumors of shorter skirts worn abroad. One daring soul in 1890 reportedly swam several strokes under the cover of fog, and lived to tell the tale. A few sketches from the time even show women with sleeves rolled up. Elbows out. Absolute chaos. Historians continue to debate whether these small acts of defiance were fashion-led or quietly feminist in intent. Either way, the tide of change had begun its crawl, very slowly, as Victorian tides do. As you trudge back to your bathing machine, dripping and 5 pounds heavier, you pass another woman trying valiantly to shield her modesty from a rogue breeze. Her parasol has become a kind of flapping semaphore. You nod in quiet solidarity. Inside the machine, you peel off layers of wool, wringing out the worst offenders into a bucket. You smell vaguely of salt, damp tweed, and courage. You feel cleaner, but not quite refreshed. This was not a spa experience. It was a rite of passage. And yet, there's a quiet pride in having done it. You bathed Victorian style. You braved the modesty gauntlet. And you emerged, sun-kissed only where your gloves allowed. You wrap yourself in a dry shawl, sip from a flask of weak tea, and gaze out the little curtained window of your bathing machine as it creaks slowly back up the beach. Someone's bonnet is still floating at sea. You squint into the silvery morning haze, where sunlight trickles through a thin English fog and catches faintly on the rim of your borrowed parasol. You've emerged from the sea, modestly, of course, having been hurled into the surf by a cheerful woman named Doris, your assigned dipper, and now you sit beneath a faded canvas awning, waiting for your toes to dry and your dignity to return. Around you, the beach begins to fill with the rustle of petticoats, the whisper of turning pages in pocket novels, and the low, dangerous flutter of sunbonnets. This, dear sun-seeking listener, is where things get strangely complicated. The sun, the skin, and who's allowed to look like they've ever interacted. In the Victorian seaside world, exposure to sunlight was a class marker as much as a health risk. A tan, or, heaven forbid, freckles, was a signal that you worked outside, that you were perhaps a milkmaid or a gardener or someone who knew how to thatch something. In short, not the ideal impression for a lady of leisure who wished to waft through a drawing room like a moral breeze. Which is why, of course, you're now watching a group of women tiptoe across the sand with the urgent clumsiness of people trying to both enjoy themselves and not get any actual sun on their faces. Their parasols bloom like nervous hydrangeas, casting precise little shadows over powdered cheeks. Historians still argue whether the obsession with pale skin was driven more by aesthetics or by the Victorian tendency to believe nearly everything was a moral failing, including suntans. Some etiquette guides warned against immodest pinkness on the neck or forearms, equating oversunned skin with a breezy attitude toward virtue. Because nothing says moral decline quite like a sun-kissed décolletage. You glance down at your own forearms, faintly flushed after your brave 93-second immersion in the English Channel. Will society know? Will they whisper behind their fans that you've become rustic? This anxious dance with sunlight gave rise to what might be the most elaborately inefficient sun avoidance technology of the age, the face veil. A gauzy netting, sometimes tied over bonnets or stitched into wide-brimmed hats, it made you look like a particularly aristocratic beekeeper. And still, women bore them, just to keep their noses from turning even slightly poetic in hue. Of course, not everyone agreed. There were always the rebels. Take, for instance, a certain Miss Angelica Turnstow, yes, her real name, or close enough, who reportedly scandalized the bathing beaches of Scarborough by appearing one July afternoon without a parasol. Just walking. In daylight. As if her skin had never read a single moral treatise. People were horrified. She got a marriage proposal before tea. Still, most bathers weren't quite so daring. They remained under canopies. Or even hired personal sunshades. Yes, actual humans paid to walk beside you holding an umbrella like some ghostly servant of the clouds. Meanwhile, the gentlemen were not entirely free from all this, either. A red nose or lobster-pink cheeks might betray time spent shooting or rowing, acceptable pastimes, but anything darker than a copper glint could label one suspiciously sporty or, worse, middle class. And so men, too, dabbled in powders and creams, including the infamous zinc oxide paste, essentially sunblock, if sunblock had the texture of wet chalk and smelled faintly of despair. Some believed seawater itself offered protection. It didn't. But that didn't stop enterprising chemists from concocting curious mixtures of vinegar, rosewater, and something called essence of turtle to soothe afterburns. You slather some on now, grimacing as it hisses faintly against your overexposed wrist. The sting is real. The turtle? Probably mythical. Curiously, the very act of tanning did enjoy a kind of whispered allure. Some artists and poets quietly praised the sun-flushed cheek, or the golden hue of a seafarer's brow, but always from a safe, aesthetic distance. It wasn't until the 20th century that fashion would flip the script and declare tan sexy, exotic, and the ultimate symbol of affluence. But for now, here on this sand-speckled blanket, you're still very much in the land of lavender powder and strategic shade. There's even a debate, ongoing to this day among historians, about whether some of the elaborate sea bathing setups, awnings, canopies, shade-creating devices on the bathing machines themselves, were primarily about modesty, or were they stealthy anti-tan tech? Evidence exists for both theories, But neither fully answers the age-old question, why, exactly, did no one invent sunglasses? A gentle breeze tousles your damp curls, and you tug your wide-brimmed bonnet lower. Nearby, a group of children stage a coup against their governess, using sand pies as artillery. You hear her sigh, perhaps dreaming of parasolless rebellion, or at least of a day when modesty didn't require so much upholstery. And then comes the true absurdity. The sun itself, as the clouds part, turns out to be lovely. Warm, golden, and gentle. You tilt your face upward, just for a moment, before remembering yourself and recoiling into the shade with the elegance of a startled tortoise. A woman beside you leans over, voice low. A bit much, that sun, she says with conspiratorial glee. You nod, complicit in your shared dread of vitamin D. There is something oddly comforting, you realize, in this communal fear of sunburns and scandal. Everyone, from Duchess to day tripper, united in the noble cause of remaining slightly blue under the eyes. So you adjust your shawl, reapply your floral face water, mostly rose, maybe a whisper of pickled beet, and settle in to watch the sea sparkle from a safe, shaded distance. Because in Victorian England, glowing was fine. But glowing with health? Entirely too forward. You're bundled in a damp towel, a bit pink around the edges, wondering if salt water actually cures anything other than boredom. That's when you spot a stern-looking gentleman striding down the promenade in a starched waistcoat, and an expression that suggests he might diagnose you from 20 paces. He's a Victorian physician, and unlike most people in your life, he wants you to go directly into the ocean. Repeatedly. See, back in the day, doctors didn't just tolerate seaside holidays. They prescribed them with the gravitas normally reserved for surgery or spiritual intervention. If you had gout, you needed seawater. If your child was too energetic, seawater. If your wife had melancholia, wanted to be left alone for 5 minutes, you guessed it, seawater. The waves were believed to contain minerals that could leach away your afflictions, though historians still argue whether this was based on anything more than Victorian optimism and a decent bribe from local innkeepers. So you follow the doctor's advice and return to your bathing machine for yet another medically necessary splash. He instructs you not to enjoy it too much. That might compromise the therapeutic effect. You're to walk briskly into the sea, no dallying, stay precisely 11 minutes, and then emerge before the cold sets in. According to a pamphlet he waves at you, this will realign your humors. You suspect it might also give you pneumonia. But who are you to question a man with a mustache that commanding? There's a prevailing theory, popular at the time, that seawater enters your pores and recharges your internal batteries. Not batteries in the way you understand them. These were more like philosophical batteries powered by animal electricity, a delightful phrase borrowed from Galvani and largely misunderstood. Some physicians swore by a brisk sea plunge followed by a warm flannel rub-down, ideally by a trained assistant who wouldn't giggle when you shrieked from the cold. Even the Royal Navy got involved. Naval hospitals along the coast would dunk convalescent sailors into the sea, arguing it toughened the constitution and deterred malingering. If it didn't heal them, at least it woke them up. And in a time before antibiotics, hot baths, or sensible shoes, cold seawater was genuinely one of the more benign treatments available. Better that than leeches. You overhear a rather fragile-looking man in a striped robe informing his wife that his physician recommended 5 dips a week, no less, or the vapors shall return. She nods, unimpressed. Another woman insists her daughter's freckles have diminished since visiting the shore, possibly due to the iodine content in the air, or possibly because the daughter has simply learned to avoid direct sunlight. Boys, and all joy. There's also talk of sea air. Not just the water, mind you. The very atmosphere is considered curative. The salty breeze, filled with negative ions and optimistic medical guesswork, is believed to cleanse the lungs. Tuberculosis patients are brought to the seaside in droves, propped up on deck chairs with lap blankets and a 1,000-yard stare, all under the hopeful eyes of family and physicians. It's not uncommon to find sanatoriums perched on seaside cliffs, as though daring the wind to do its healing work unaided. As you trudge up from the waves again, trailing kelp and dignity, your attendant hands you a small glass of something vile. It's seawater, distilled and bottled, sold as a tonic. You drink it politely and immediately regret your life choices. There's also seaweed tea, salt lozenges, and even patented marine electuary paste, which seems like it should be banned in at least 4 countries. Victorians, bless them, were not afraid to consume the ocean in as many ways as possible. Still, some benefits weren't entirely imagined. Moving away from smoky cities and into the cleaner seaside air did, in many cases, ease respiratory conditions. And walking barefoot on sand, getting gentle sun exposure, in a fully buttoned outfit, naturally, and even the sheer novelty of not dying from industrial pollution probably helped people feel, if not cured, at least less miserable. But the line between healing and hysteria is always thin. One popular quack, Dr. Marmaduke Northcote, yes, that's his real name, insisted that saltwater exposure also improved memory and eliminated unwelcome thoughts. How exactly he tested this is unclear. One imagines he asked his patients to recall embarrassing moments, and then shoved them off a pier. Results were inconclusive. To make things more exciting, the truly devoted might take shock dips. These involved entering the sea first thing in the morning when the water was coldest and the risk of heart attack was highest. You were encouraged not to scream too loudly, lest you alarm the horses or scandalize an elderly duchess. As the tide rolls in once more and you prepare for yet another health-giving immersion, you glance around at your fellow invalids. They hobble, wheeze, shiver, and occasionally giggle. Perhaps it's the salt, the sun, or just the absurdity of the entire exercise, but somehow, everyone seems a little bit lighter. One thing's certain, no matter the ailment, no matter the remedy, Victorians never did anything halfway. If a little sea air was good, then gallons of it must be better. If one dip a week was helpful, then daily plunges must be practically divine. And if any part of you still suffered after all that, well, it was probably your fault for not believing hard enough. Brighton, bribery, and royal bikinis, almost. By now, you've developed a peculiar fondness for your wheeled wooden bathing box. It rattles, it creaks, and it smells faintly of wet rope and lavender soap. But it's also your chariot to the sea, and, if you squint, it feels ever so slightly royal. Speaking of royalty, things are about to take a rather extravagant turn. Because here in Brighton, your seaside escapade collides with none other than the Prince Regent himself, George IV in training wheels. This was before he grew into the heavily powdered, velvet-loving monarch we all vaguely remember from museum gift shops. Back then, George was busy reinventing the English seaside with a flair for the theatrical and a wallet that could bend time. You're sitting on a wooden bench, nursing a tepid lemonade, which, incidentally, contains no lemon, when a commotion ripples through the promenade. Parasol tips wobble. Bonnet strings flutter. A series of audible gasps rustles down the beach like a Regency-era wave. Enter the prince. Or rather, enter his entourage, feathers, footmen, and faint whiffs of brandy, followed eventually by the man himself, gloriously overdressed for sea air. Imagine a crimson velvet jacket, lace cuffs, and gold buttons, plus a cane topped with what appears to be a miniature lion. A man dressed like upholstery, strolling past women so swaddled in linen they look like emotionally reserved jellyfish. George didn't invent the Brighton Beach craze, but he certainly polished it with gold leaf. Historians still argue whether his real aim was health, social distraction, or sheer showmanship, but what's certain is this: he made sea bathing scandalously fashionable. Under doctor's orders, probably bribed with a peerage, he declared that the bracing sea air was the only cure for his gout, which seems to have coincided rather neatly with his desire to escape the formalities of London and frolic about with a suspicious number of opera singers. But George didn't just dip in the sea. Oh no. He built the Royal Pavilion, a seaside pleasure palace that looked like an Indian mosque crossed with a very ambitious wedding cake. While your bathing machine bumps over pebbles, his entourage hoists velvet curtains and unpacks perfumed towels. The contrast is humbling. Despite his grandeur, George insisted on being just like the people, which in practice meant being carried into the sea by 2 servants while wearing something between a toga and a shower curtain. Eyewitnesses differ on whether this counts as bathing or theatrical flailing. Either way, the public was delighted. Of course, His arrival brought changes. Overnight, the beach saw a flurry of new bathing machines, each more ostentatious than the last. One had brass fittings. Another had velvet cushions. And yes, one was painted entirely in royal blue and lined with silk, because apparently salt water and common sense are not required to mingle. The townspeople cashed in immediately. You can almost hear the ink drying on hastily rebranded shop signs: Royal Seaweed Tonic, Princess Approved Bathing Socks, Gout Be Gone. Local entrepreneurs sprouted like damp towels. Even the donkeys that pulled some of the machines got fancy new bridles. Naturally, the rules of modesty were strained by proximity to royalty. Rumors swirled. Some said the prince's bathing companion was not his physician, but a certain Lady H, known for her dramatic fainting spells and a beauty mark shaped like a musical note. The gossip pages had a field day. You, meanwhile, just try not to get sunburned on your shins. And yet, there's something infectious about it all. You catch yourself admiring the ornate pavilion domes as they shimmer against the sea haze. You imagine taking tea on a velvet chaise, listening to a harpsichord while your bathing machine waits patiently at the shore like a loyal pet. There's even a persistent legend, whispered by fishwives and journal-writing governesses, that the prince once requested a special bathing costume with gilded embroidery. Fit for Neptune, he allegedly declared. Some say he even tried to commission a two-piece version, what would now be called a bikini, though it's more likely he misunderstood the structural limitations of wool. Still, it leaves you wondering what Victorian fashion history might have looked like if he'd pulled it off. Would we now be wearing cravats to the beach? Would sunscreen come in crystal decanters? Even now, as a stiff breeze rattles your machine's curtain, you can feel the ripple effect of his reign. The seaside became less a place for quiet recovery and more a theater of identity, a stage where people performed health, virtue, flirtation, and sometimes, outrageous royal self-indulgence. And Brighton? It never quite returned to sleepy fishing village status. With George came opera singers, French chefs, and more waistcoats than a haberdashery on fire. The very idea of sea air was elevated to the same level as wine or poetry. Something to be tasted, savored, and ideally, observed by at least 6 well-dressed strangers. So you finish your drink, rise from your creaky bench, and begin trudging toward the surf again, wondering if your machine could use a coat of paint. Maybe not royal blue. Maybe just bluish. The wind picks up just as you're halfway through a very polite, but vaguely terrifying conversation with your dipper. She has arms like cannon barrels, a no-nonsense bonnet, and an expression that suggests she's seen things, possibly involving jellyfish and the moral downfall of tourists. You're in the bathing machine, rattling gently as it's backed toward the churning waves by a pair of unimpressed horses. The creak of the wooden wheels and the muffled slosh of the tide blend into a rhythm that might have been soothing, if not for the growing suspicion that something has gone terribly off schedule. The tide, you see, doesn't particularly care for your plans. Historians still argue whether sea bathing machine operators in the late Victorian period were truly skilled tide trackers or simply optimistic. You begin to wonder if your particular driver fell into the latter category, especially when one horse neighs in protest and the machine lurches sideways. The wheel catches a rut, tips slightly, and for a moment, you are a mobile tea cabinet caught in a seaside existential crisis. Bathing machines were, in theory, simple things, small huts on wheels, hauled into the water so you could emerge discreetly into the surf, avoiding the searing gaze of humanity. But they were also, you now realize, a little like the early prototypes of roller coasters, wooden, unpredictable, and only questionably tested. With enough wind and just the right amount of soggy sand beneath the wheels, the entire contraption could become a runaway vessel. Which is exactly what's happening now. You brace yourself as the machine tips again, this time more enthusiastically, and starts to slide. Your dipper, who's been walking alongside, pauses to shout something encouraging in an accent that turns every word into a hearty vowel stew. Then she disappears from view. The horses have had enough. They veer off course, dragging the bathing machine at a gallop parallel to the surf, creating a wake worthy of a small steamboat. This, as it turns out, is not entirely uncommon. One story from the 1870s recounts how a bathing machine in Scarborough was carried clear down the beach, its occupant unaware until she opened the back curtain and saw an entirely different town. Another machine in Brighton was once capsized entirely by a wave, giving birth to a short-lived moral panic about aquatic hysteria, a condition that roughly translated to a perfectly reasonable fear of drowning in a rolling cupboard. As you bump along, the soundscape becomes chaotic, squawks from alarmed gulls, frantic clopping from the horses, and a sort of wooden yawn from the roof as it flexes with each jolt. You consider your attire, which includes a pair of soggy cotton stockings, an experimental waterproof corset, and a bonnet that is now folding in on itself like a sad soufflé. You look, in short, like a scandalized sponge. Just as you start to debate whether the etiquette manual covers screaming during runaway sea bathing events, the machine grinds to a halt in a suspiciously tilted position. The door flies open. Your dipper appears like a heroic specter, brandishing what may be a picnic blanket and a shoehorn. She steadies the machine with the calm of someone who once fought a seal over a shrimp sandwich. "Right," she says, and beckons. You tiptoe out, soaked, stunned, and only moderately sun-kissed. Behind you, the horses exhale deeply, like they've just bested an awkward first date. The sea gurgles its amusement. Somewhere nearby, someone claps, though it might just be two fish slapping together in solidarity. And while your afternoon took an unscheduled turn into maritime slapstick, you're not alone in your experience. Bathing machine accidents were part of the lore. Local papers often reported these incidents with an air of deadpan fascination. Lady Frimbly taken aground near Rock Pool was one memorable headline. Another simply read, "For bathers disembark in wrong town, credit tide." The truth is, the Victorians were deeply serious about their seaside rituals. But nature always had the final say. You might plan for a modest dip followed by a discreet lemon ice, but the ocean occasionally voted otherwise. This sort of capes birthed innovations, too. Later models of bathing machines came with brakes, anchors, even early forms of stabilizing outriggers, essentially glorified oars glued to the sides. Some had bells to alert the dipper, though most reports suggest these were used primarily by panicking bathers trying to summon assistance, or possibly snacks. Of course, modern audiences may struggle to understand why such a system persisted for so long. But then again, when you consider Victorian priorities, modesty above all, including oxygen, the logic reveals itself. Better a surprise trip down the coastline than risk someone glimpsing a shoulder. You wring out your bonnet, which is now roughly the size and weight of a sleeping cat. Your dipper hands you a peppermint, and mutters something that might be good sport, or the tide's a gossip. You nod solemnly. The sun breaks through a cloud just long enough to glint off the damp hem of your bathing dress, and for a brief moment, you feel oddly triumphant. You survived the mobile wardrobe of doom. You probably won't be knighthood for it, but you also probably won't forget it. Now, shall we get you dried off and into a sun chair before your next adventure? Don't worry, this one involves snacks. The rules arrive with a rustle of paper fans and a discreet cough. By now, you've survived the winch-powered plunge, the weighty tyranny of layered wool, and at least one accidental crab encounter. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare you for the tightly corseted web of Victorian seaside etiquette. Just when you thought you might enjoy a leisurely walk along the shingle, you're met with a new challenge: behaving correctly in public while damp, sandy, and moderately confused. You stand by the promenade, a towel draped over one arm like a confused footman, as you scan the scene. Around you, parasols bloom like cautious jellyfish. Everywhere, people are walking in slow, deliberate lines, never too fast, never too slow. You take a tentative step and realize you've committed your first offense, walking unaccompanied. A lone woman gasps. A nearby chaperone narrows her eyes. You are, quite suddenly, a public spectacle. The Victorians, bless them, invented a staggering number of social codes, many of which applied doubly at the beach, where the proximity of sun, strangers, and the occasional flash of calf created moral chaos. Historians still argue whether these etiquette rules emerged from a sincere belief in public decency, or were simply a national pastime of keeping track of who looked slightly too pleased with themselves, You attempt conversation with a woman holding an impressively coordinated seashell handbag, but she turns away precisely 12 degrees, just enough to signal disinterest without creating a scandal. The message is clear: you've spoken to her before a formal introduction. Somewhere nearby, a monocle likely fogs in disapproval. Eye contact, too, is treacherous. Too much, and you're presumptuous. Too little, and you're sullen. You settle for something between amiable dear and slightly lost lighthouse keeper. One of the more amusing yet entirely serious rules involved umbrella fencing. Not as dramatic as it sounds, umbrella fencing was the unspoken game of positioning one's sunshade in such a way as to block the view of unsanctioned sights, exposed wrists, saucy newspapers, or, heaven forbid, a gentleman's uncovered forearms. You walk past two matrons mid-duel, their parasols clacking as they try to outshade a suspiciously reclining youth. They nod politely as you pass, then return to battle. There are also rules about sea-facing and shore-facing posture, depending on your gender and marital status. A married woman may stand with her back to the sea, as she is presumed uninterested in new adventure. An unmarried woman, meanwhile, must face the water but avoid leaning too far forward, lest she seem enthusiastic. Children are exempt from etiquette. This is widely regarded as an injustice by everyone over age 10. They are permitted to shriek, fling kelp, and fall over without consequence. You, on the other hand, must smile politely while avoiding both kelp and conversation. Even greetings are carefully calibrated. A nod is for acquaintances. A hat tip is for friends. A hand wave? Scandalous. Some etiquette guides even suggested using a discreet cough to indicate familiarity, though this, unsurprisingly, led to epidemics of confusion during actual bouts of seaside illness. At a certain point, you sit on a deck chair and pretend to read a novel titled Moral Improvement Through Seaside Exposure. It's 478 pages long, smells faintly of sardines, and contains the most thrilling sentence you've seen in hours. Her collarbones shimmered, modestly, of course, beneath the afternoon sun. Spicy stuff. And yet, beneath all the rules, there's a strange kind of comfort. The predictability. The choreography. The knowledge that everyone's playing the same ridiculous game. You watch as a young couple navigates this social obstacle course with quiet genius. He accidentally drops a handkerchief, she helpfully retrieves it, their eyes meet under the approving gaze of two napping chaperones. It's practically a Shakespearean subplot. Historians still argue whether such elaborate etiquette functioned primarily to control behavior or to give people a sanctioned way to break the rules. After all, rules are only fun when they can be bent. As you walk along the tide line, careful not to splash, you notice someone's drawn a heart in the sand with a parasol tip. Nearby, a faint trail of two sets of footprints vanish into the foam. You smile. Someone's playing the game very well indeed. You pause at a refreshment stand where a heavily mustached man offers properly modest lemonade. It tastes like disappointment and cucumber, but you nod approvingly. It's what's expected. By the end of the day, you've learned to nod 17 different ways, adjust your bonnet angle to signal mild interest in poetry, and cough ambiguously to signal yes, I see you. You haven't spoken more than 8 full words, but somehow, you feel deeply involved in the lives of half the beachgoers. As the sun sets behind a horizon of dignified silhouettes and politely shaded ankles, you realize something curious. You've had quite a pleasant time, without ever once doing anything improper, overly exciting, or damply impulsive. You glance at your reflection in the rippling tide. Upright posture. Gloved hands. An air of composed bemusement. You're practically Victorian now. You've barely dried off from your last dip in the sea, the echoes of parasol fencing and sand-splattered etiquette still fresh in your mind, when a sudden, high-pitched shriek cuts through the salty air. No, it's not the call of a distant gull or an overzealous dipper. It's the unmistakable war cry of a Victorian child charging full speed across the shingle beach, armed with nothing but a tin pail, sticky fingers, and limitless energy. You look down just in time to sidestep a blur of pinafores and curls. Victorian children, it seems, are not merely allowed to run riot on the sand, they are expected to. and they do so with a mix of ungovernable glee and an impressive lack of peripheral awareness. These miniature humans in voluminous cotton smocks are the terror and joy of the seaside. Their garments are designed less for freedom of movement and more for resisting minor floods. The average child is wrapped like a picnic ham in starch linen, topped with an ill-advised sailor hat or a bonnet that keeps trying to eat their ears. You spy a pair of them trying to dig to Australia with nothing more than a bent spoon. Another group is loudly debating whether jellyfish can be trained, while the smallest child of all has somehow gotten hold of a lobster and is attempting to make it wear spectacles. This scene is chaotic, yes, but also curiously endearing. For Victorian families, taking the children to the seaside was both a moral duty and a test of endurance. Doctors recommended sea air for growing lungs and frazzled temperaments, and magazines extolled the virtues of innocent seaside amusements for children. But historians still argue whether this was more about the health of the child, or giving the adults a brief excuse to stare at the horizon and forget that little Georgie had just flung a shrimp at someone's bonnet. At this time in history, formal schooling didn't always occupy a child's days, and summers could stretch endlessly, particularly for those from the more affluent classes. So a trip to the seaside wasn't just a treat, it was a status symbol. And while the wealthy brought full trunks of toys, books, and embroidered collapsible beach chairs, the middle classes made do with buckets, biscuits, and stern warnings not to cause a scene. One mainstream fact you might not know: Punch and Judy shows, those eternally violent and oddly beloved puppet performances, became seaside staples in this period. Children would sit rapt, squealing with delight as Mr. Punch hit everyone, including his wife and a crocodile, with a stick. Morally questionable, yes, but apparently deeply relaxing. You inch toward a calmer part of the sand, careful not to step on any abandoned jelly sandwiches, when a boy with freckles and a strong sense of personal narrative presents you with a rare fossil he's found. You recognize it as a clump of seaweed wrapped around a sardine tin, but you nod solemnly and accept it with the gravitas it deserves. There's a fringe detail here that deserves attention. Some parents would hire seaside photographers to stage dramatic portraits of their children battling imaginary sea monsters, complete with papier-mâché tentacles and nervous donkeys. These theatrical snapshots were later turned into postcards, miniature, sepia-colored memories of sandy mischief. Meanwhile, on the more disciplined edges of the beach, governesses tried to instill order. You watch one valiantly attempt to teach arithmetic to her reluctant charge using seashells, only to have her entire lesson plan disrupted by a rogue crab and a too confident seagull. A few beachgoers clap. The crab bows modestly. As the day stretches on, the children's energy wanes not at all. They organize elaborate sandcastle tournaments judged entirely by which one has the most flags, or whose moat can best trap a sibling. The rules shift constantly. You try not to laugh when one child solemnly informs another that touching seaweed guarantees eternal itchiness. It's probably not true, but you find yourself avoiding it anyway. The Victorians had a curious attitude toward their offspring, simultaneously viewing them as tiny adults in training and chaotic symbols of moral development. They were expected to behave, but also expected to run, jump, and scream in short, dignified bursts. The beach offered a sort of controlled chaos, a liminal space where childhood could briefly take over without threatening the empire. Even bathing machines had to adapt. Some resorts introduced juvenile bathing machines, smaller carts painted with cheerful motifs, often accompanied by a designated nursery dipper, essentially a nanny with waterproof patience. There are reports, still debated, of seaside towns even running child-only bathing sessions to give adults a break and reduce the chance of small feet kicking strangers mid-splash. Back on your patch of sand, the evening light begins to soften. The air smells of brine, lemonade, and the lingering threat of a muddy sock in your satchel. The children show no signs of stopping. One is trying to fly a kite with the string tied around a dog's tail. Another is attempting to barter an oyster shell for a sausage. No one questions this logic. You settle in, watching them from the safety of your picnic blanket. It's a tableau both timeless and utterly Victorian: structured chaos, gentle mischief, and a remarkable number of striped knickerbockers. And just as you're about to close your eyes for a short seaside doze, a small voice near your ear says, quite seriously, don't move. There's a crab in your shoe. You've just escaped a mild squabble involving two bonnet matrons arguing over whose parasol was the more ladylike shade of lavender, and now, naturally, you're hungry. The salty sea breeze tickles your nostrils, and somewhere nearby, the unmistakable scent of something fried, possibly edible, wafts through the air. Welcome to the culinary wonderland of the Victorian seaside, where food is either questionable, curative, or accidentally both. There's no boardwalk per se. Those wouldn't become popular until the Americans got excited about wood and capitalism. But along the pebbly edge of the beach, enterprising vendors peddle their wares from carts, baskets, and dubious little tents. You approach a stall covered in faded bunting where a woman named Maud, who appears to have lived entirely off pickled herring for the past 40 years, offers you a scallop pudding. You politely decline. Historians still argue whether some of these beachside concoctions were genuine attempts at nutrition or merely an elaborate dare that got out of hand. But one thing's certain, Victorian beach snacks were defined less by taste and more by what could survive a half day in the sun without turning lethal. Let's begin with shellfish. Nothing says seaside glamour quite like balancing a teetering paper cone of whelks in one hand while batting away flies with the other. Whelks, rubbery, spiral-shelled sea snails, are slathered in vinegar and served lukewarm, presumably to prevent any sudden enjoyment. And then there are cockles, which are less threatening to chew but always come with a grain of sand for that authentic coastal crunch. Still, you brave it. You scoop up a single cockle, pop it into your mouth, and immediately understand why the Victorians developed so many euphemisms for disappointment. Nearby, a boy with a newsboy cap 4 sizes too large is selling rock candy stamped with the word Brighton all the way through. It's roughly the length of a fireplace poker and twice as brittle. Children gnaw it into weapons. Adults use it to stir tea or intimidate seagulls. No one actually finishes one. Then there's the ice cream, if it can be called that. There are no freezers here, not really, unless you count a damp hole filled with imported Norwegian ice and someone's retired corset to keep it cool. Ice cream vendors scoop mysterious semi-solid mounds into tin dishes and, for reasons lost to time, sprinkle them with grated nutmeg or even cayenne pepper. Your serving is pale green and flavored faintly of cucumber and regret. An older gentleman beside you happily digs in, announcing it's just a thing for a touch of biliousness. You nod respectfully. He seems to be enjoying it, or has simply lost the will to resist. Of course, the Victorian obsession with digestion means that many seaside foods are less about flavor and more about function. A nice bit of jellied eel will calm the nerves, one vendor insists, holding out something gelatinous and vaguely amphibian. And the vinegar's medicinal. The idea of sea air and certain foods as curative goes deep. Entire families come to the coast not for merriment, but for meals prescribed by seaside doctors. A weak constitution? A breakfast of boiled haddock. Persistent melancholy? Try pickled limpets. Romantic disappointment? Nothing a hot cup of beef tea won't solve. That last one is, alarmingly, literal. Even the humble sandwich gets the Victorian treatment. Egg and cress on moist brown bread wrapped in 3 layers of oilcloth. Not because it improves the taste, but because sand gets everywhere. You bite into one and get a hint of freshness, followed by a determined crunch from something that definitely isn't lettuce. And then there's the famous seaside pie. Every region seems to have one. In Scarborough, it's filled with oysters. In Blackpool, it's beef and onion. In Brighton? No one quite knows, and the locals are suspiciously vague when asked. You buy one, take a bite, and find yourself unsure whether it's sweet or savory. That ambiguity may be the point. As you sit on a rickety deck chair, whose collapse is imminent, but not urgent, you watch a vendor go by with a steaming tray of roasted chestnuts. Yes, chestnuts. In July. Apparently, there's no wrong time for nuts in small paper bags, even if the sun is trying to turn your parasol into a griddle. All around you, the beach hums with the energy of digestion and mild sunstroke. A woman faints decorously into a friend's lap, overcome by crab fumes. A child chases a meat pie into the surf. A gull makes off with someone's sardine sandwich, which may improve its flavor. Meanwhile, a group of ladies pass around a small flask of cordial, giggling and insisting it's for nerves. Victorian beach picnics are elaborate affairs. Families bring hampers the size of coffins filled with aspic-laden tranches, salmon pastes, and small baked things that wobble ominously in the sun. One family even has a collapsible table and matching doilies. As you pass, the matriarch offers you a quince tart with a look that suggests she will be deeply offended if you decline. You accept, and the tart, blessedly, is delicious. By the time the afternoon tide begins creeping back up the shore, you've sampled at least 6 suspicious delicacies, and you're starting to feel the kind of full that Victorian etiquette books delicately refer to as troubled in the middle. A light lie-down might be in order, ideally somewhere you can groan quietly without judgment. The sea glitters. A couple strolls by arguing over whether their gingerbread had a hint of sardine, or the sardine a hint of gingerbread. No one's sure, but everyone agrees the beach simply wouldn't be the same without a touch of indigestion and a pocket full of boiled sweets. You wander past the row of tilted parasols and neatly fenced-off sand patches, feeling the afternoon sun filter through the gauzy haze of salt and seaweed. The air carries a soft blend of peppermint drops and faintly overboiled mackerel. There's a strange rhythm to the Victorian seaside. Bathing machines clatter toward the waves, children shriek intermittently, and every so often, someone discreetly clears their throat to alert others they are most definitely not watching anything inappropriate. And yet, here you are, tiptoeing around one of the more unspoken dances of the era, the gentle art of seaside courtship. Welcome to the glorious, awkward arena of flirtation, Victorian style. You spot a gentleman, his mustache freshly waxed, his shoes inexplicably polished for the sand, standing precisely 3 paces from a woman whose parasol tilt suggests mild interest. Neither speaks. A breeze picks up, causing her hat ribbons to flutter dramatically. He adjusts his cravat, possibly to communicate longing. You stand awkwardly between them, unsure if you've just interrupted a proposal or a particularly intense staring contest. Courtship rules at the seaside were even more labyrinthine than their city counterparts. While London drawing rooms required etiquette, bathing beaches required stealth. Here, couples had to navigate their affection through layers of lace, layers of chaperones, and occasionally, literal layers of sea mist. You were supposed to be there for your health, remember, not to fall in love with the man whose mother hired your bathing machine. Historians still argue whether these seaside romances were more liberating or just differently confined. One camp claims the ocean air allowed for a certain spirited rebellion. Another believes it merely moved the same restrictions to sandier terrain. What's certain is that eyes did far more than look, and hands rarely brushed. You sit near the pier and watch 2 machines trundle toward the water side by side. Coincidence? Perhaps. But everyone seems to know they contain a Miss O and a Mr. B, who are both incidentally scheduled for the 3:30 slot. Their respective dippers, ever discreet, nod knowingly as they offer hands and avert eyes. It's not much, but in a society where a misplaced glove could spark gossip, a synchronized dunk into the channel is basically a declaration of love. Sometimes couples courted with hand signals. Others exchanged notes via small children or seagull feeding interruptions. There's one delightful case from Margate where a young man claimed to have accidentally dropped his poetry notebook near a lady's bonnet 3 days in a row. The 4th day, she returned it, without reading it, of course, but with a violet tucked inside. And then there were the rendezvous in moonlight. You're told about them in hushed tones. After the machines were locked, the chaperones retired, and the beach emptied to only the sound of waves and muffled giggles. A young couple might wander the shore, separated by 6 inches of propriety and a full universe of intention. Once, a night bathing attempt ended abruptly when a young gentleman stepped on a sea cucumber and screamed loud enough to summon half the Coast Guard. Still, beneath the stiffness and starch, there's something unmistakably sweet. These were people who dressed in 4 layers to paddle ankle-deep, who scheduled their courtships by tide charts and hatpins. Even the bathing machines, with their clunky charm, became part of the flirtation ritual, who was seen entering when, and with whose mother watching from the dunes. It's hard not to chuckle at the logistics. You imagine a young woman trying to hint affection through the angle of her parasol, the flutter of her bathing dress, and a carefully timed trip near the saltwater taffy cart. Today's texts and emojis are practically cheating compared to the Victorian code of subtle handkerchief drops and shared lemonade glances. One fringe anecdote mentions a pair who fell in love entirely through towel exchanges. Each left embroidered messages on the other's striped drying cloth, passed via a bride dipper named Clara who pretended she couldn't read but absolutely could and probably sold the tale to a local paper later. The couple married. Clara got a small inheritance in the will. No one mentions the towels. And yes, even amidst these modest games, scandal could spark with alarming speed. One wrongly interpreted wave from a bathing machine window might inspire 3 letters to an editor and 2 dramatic faintings in the tea room. The gossip mill at the beach was tireless. Elderly women with opera glasses could make or break a romance before the next tide rolled in. Still, the sea had a way of softening things. Arguments didn't echo so loudly, and stolen glances felt more poetic when framed by distant sails and murmuring surf. As you watch the tide inch forward, you feel the hush settle again. The flirtations fade into silhouettes, half concealed in mist and time, lovely in their clumsy sincerity. So you sit, legs stretched in the sand, brushing granules off your cuffs and wondering how many proposals began as nothing more than shared sunburns and silent nods at dawn. Mechanical mischief and moonlight dips. The tide is lower now, the sky tinted in bruised lavender, and the last traces of official decency have packed themselves neatly into wicker baskets. The bathing machines, those prim wooden boxes of modesty, stand in a slanting line like slightly disapproving ants, now unattended and vaguely suspicious of the hush falling over the beach. This, dear nocturnal adventurer, is when things get interesting. As twilight falls over the Victorian coastline, the rules, much like the tide, begin to recede. You hear a giggle, definitely not sanctioned, followed by a splash. It's moonlight dipping hour, the unofficial, ungodly time when tightly laced propriety loosens a few bodice hooks and lets its hair down, literally. You pause by a salt-stained dune as a group of young people, rather underdressed for any proper occasion, dash toward the water. Someone whispers something about borrowing a machine. Someone else replies she won't miss it till morning. Let's be clear, this is not entirely legal, nor entirely frowned upon. It's that middle ground Victorians excelled at, deniably disreputable. One enterprising gentleman, wearing only his reputation and some questionably tailored linen drawers, hauls open the door to a machine. It creaks in protest, likely unaccustomed to such late hours. These moonlight escapades were known in whispers, bathers seeking the thrill of the forbidden, far from the squint of the matronly dipper or the disapproving gaze of Aunt Mildred from the promenade. Of course, such ventures were not without risk. The horses, those noble beasts tasked with dragging your modesty box into the waves, were often tucked away by this time. So bathers did the dragging themselves, which looked, frankly, ridiculous. 2 young men, elbow-deep in brine, grunting and slipping in seaweed, attempt to move one of the lighter machines. It does not move. It plants its wheels in the sand like a judgmental tree stump. Historians still argue whether these illicit dips were acts of youthful rebellion, or simply the only way to cool off after spending the day in 9 layers of itchy wool. Whatever the motivation, it's clear that the beach transformed after dark into something rather less supervised. By the 1880s, Seaside constables began adding nighttime patrols to their list of duties, not because of rampant crime, but to keep an eye on couples who seemed unusually enthusiastic about their aquatic pursuits. One such patrol famously found a lady and a gentleman in a state of mutual undress inside a machine still attached to its horse. The official report included the priceless phrase, "The animals showed signs of distress." But moonlight bathing wasn't always naughty. Sometimes it was just deeply impractical. Imagine this, you clambering over a slippery step, your candle stub flickering in the wind, attempting to close the door of your creaky bathing machine while holding your hat on with one hand and your towel with the other. The sea, ever the opportunist, decides to welcome you with a surprisingly cold slap across the ankles. You yelp, a sound that startles a nearby gull into early retirement. There was also the problem of visibility. Without the aid of gaslights or moonbeams, many bathers found themselves hopelessly lost in waist-high surf. One anecdote from Scarborough tells of a gentleman who, mistaking another machine for his own, emerged wearing a lady's bonnet and an expression of profound confusion. The lady, reportedly, did not appreciate the swap. Despite the inherent chaos, there was something magical about it all. The salt air at night felt different, cooler, charged with whispers. The wooden planks of the boardwalk creaked like secrets, and the sea itself seemed softer, like it was trying to help everyone get away with something. It's easy to see why couples sought it out, why poets wrote about it, and why several enterprising hotels eventually tried to formalize it with moonlight bathing packages, which were, unsurprisingly, vetoed by local clergy almost immediately. One of the most infamous tales comes from 1897, when a group of amateur actors celebrating a local theater premiere attempted to reenact a Greek tragedy in the surf by torchlight. Costumes were minimal, enthusiasm was high, and one bathing machine caught fire. The performance ended when the lead actor, still wearing a papier-mâché trident, was chased by a very annoyed crab and fell into a tide pool. Still, these moments persisted, becoming part of the unwritten folklore of the British seaside. You can almost hear the stories echoing through the sand, of secret trysts, midnight misadventures, and the occasional machine that simply floated away, never to be seen again. Well, except by a startled fisherman 3 days later who found it halfway to France, complete with a pair of corsets and a dented flask. By now your feet are wet, the hem of your borrowed dressing gown clings to your calves, and someone's dog is barking at a suspiciously buoyant top hat drifting out to sea. You shiver, not from cold, but from the delight of having witnessed this secret chapter of beach history unfold under a sky thick with stars and Victorian mischief. You're reclining now in your deck chair, a modest woolen shawl over your lap, gazing out at the endless blue horizon while spooning tepid custard from a paper cup with a worryingly soft spoon. But your ears perk up. Not at the gulls, nor the waves, nor the distant bell of the toffee man. No, it's the sibilant hum of seaside gossip that draws your attention, crackling softly beneath parasols like wind through reeds. In Victorian Britain, the beach wasn't just for sun, sea, and awkward plunges from wheeled huts. It was also a veritable fountain of low-stakes scandal. And with scandal came stories. And with stories came postcards. You walk, gingerly still damp from your recent supervised dip, into a seaside gift shop. There, between the salt rock candy and small tin whistles in the shape of ducks, lies the Victorian equivalent of tabloid journalism, the seaside postcard. Not the bright technicolor type with cartoon crabs and gaudy lettering. These are hand-colored, delicately inked, and occasionally, just a bit, cheeky. Mr. P in machine number 4? According to a certain Miss H, writing under the obvious pseudonym A Lady of Leisure, he may have accidentally left his curtains open while adjusting his bathing drawers. She notes, with exaggerated horror and very precise observation, that she glimpsed a noble white knee. A noble knee, in 1878, was practically the height of reckless abandon. Postcards became not just souvenirs but sneaky tools of coded messaging and suggestive storytelling. A lady could send a card to her cousin in London mentioning how bracing the tides were, while secretly referring to the fact that a certain Captain R. had given her his parasol when hers collapsed with suspicious timing. Historians still argue whether these veiled anecdotes were a genuine form of flirtation or simply a symptom of people having way too much unstructured leisure time. But it wasn't just individual flirts and flusters. Whole families would develop reputations. You hear a pair of ladies on a nearby bench whispering about the Featherstone Fitzhughs, who, it seems, always insisted on booking machine number 7 because it was closer to the refreshment tent and the doctor. Rumors abounded about Mrs. Featherstone's digestive concerns. You begin to wonder if your use of machine number 3 will make it into someone's journal. The gossip didn't stay confined to polite whispers or passive-aggressive diary entries. Local seaside newspapers, often one step above gossip rags, would publish letters from visitors, unsigned, of course, with pointed remarks. Is it proper, one writer asks, that a gentleman would approach the bathing area with a pipe in his mouth and no hat on his head? The horror. Even those without the funds for long holidays got in on the game. Fictional stories about seaside affairs and lost bonnets were serially published in women's magazines, sometimes thinly disguising real towns under names like Salt Commanditide. It's estimated that by the late 1800s, more than 30% of serialized fiction featured some form of seaside drama, and nearly all of it involved at least one mistaken identity, a lost shoe, or a duel narrowly avoided by someone fainting dramatically near a donkey. You pause to consider the mechanics of such storytelling. What is it about a modest wooden hut rolling into the sea that inspires this much human theater? Perhaps it's the temporary nature of it all. On the beach, everything is slightly suspended. People are outside the confines of their usual roles. A clergyman might become a shell collector. A governess might read a French novel while pretending it's a devotional. Boundaries blur. So do rules. One popular real-life case featured a known novelist, allegedly staying in disguise at a quiet shore town under the name Mr. Salt. He spent a suspicious number of days watching people return from their bathing machines and sketching in a leather notebook. Decades later, fans believe they found these same townsfolk thinly veiled in one of his novels, where the character Mrs. Kettleworm bears a strong resemblance to a real widow who was once seen arguing with a fishmonger over the price of eels. Still, perhaps the most charming evidence of all lies in the margins of old guest books. Seaside hotels kept leather-bound ledgers for visitors to sign, and some couldn't resist scribbling comments that were part gratitude, part passive aggression, and part fanfiction. One line reads, June 3rd, stormy weather. Shared an umbrella with a dark-haired stranger. May not recover. Another, more cryptic, to whomever lost a green ribbon in Machine 9, I have it still. You shuffle back to your spot by the dunes, warmed by the idea that modesty, machines, and murmured speculation created a whole genre of human connection. And as a final image dances across your mind, of two gloved hands brushing briefly while passing the salt, you can't help but wonder if perhaps the beach was never just about the sea. It was about permission. To be noticed. To be slightly less yourself. Or maybe slightly more. You've now dried off, mostly, and strolled far enough down the beach to start wondering whether other countries were just as enchanted by the idea of being wheeled, fully clothed, into the sea under strict moral supervision. As it turns out, Britain wasn't the only place swept up in the modesty meets maritime phenomenon of the sea bathing machine. But, much like marmalade and parliamentary debates, not every neighbor took to it in quite the same way. First up, France. Ah, France. Land of elegance, pastries, and the occasional eyebrow-raising shrug at British prudery. The French, to the surprise of absolutely no one, approached sea bathing with a different philosophy. They embraced the idea of therapeutic dips, certainly. They'd been sending the ailing to mineral springs and coastal retreats for generations, but the notion that one needed a rolling closet to preserve dignity while getting soggy was met with, how shall we say, amused tolerance. Some seaside resorts in Normandy did install versions of the British bathing machine, especially in the 1830s and 1840s when Anglophile trends briefly took hold. But these contraptions often lost their curtains, or were simply parked as changing cabins, less a theatrical entrance into the waves, more a polite suggestion to maybe put on something before cannonballing. Historians still argue whether the French rejection of full-blown bathing machine culture was rooted more in Enlightenment liberalism, or a national distaste for soggy upholstery. What is clear, however, is that many French visitors found the British practice of using horses to haul swimmers into the sea both hilarious and slightly undignified. One 1862 French satirical cartoon shows a red-nosed British man being yanked from a cart and launched into choppy waters, monocle askew. The caption translates loosely to, Le sport du the brillant. Meanwhile, over in Germany, the vibe was a little more structured. German seaside resorts, especially those in the north, like on the island of Usedom, embraced the health-forward aspects of sea bathing with the kind of organizational flair one expects from the Prussian legacy. Bathing machines appeared, yes, but so did timetables, patient logs, and Kurzall halls where one might follow up a dip with an obligatory polka and mineral tonic. You even find the occasional tale of mechanical innovation, a Baltic spa town where the machines were fitted with rails to prevent them from drifting, or a clever rope pulley system that allowed the bather to return themselves to shore without a dipper's assistance. Autonomous modesty, brought to you by 19th century engineering. But then, let's look further afield. In Italy, the idea of sea bathing didn't exactly explode with the same rigid formalism. Yes, there were resort towns, especially near Naples and along the Ligurian coast, where the wealthy dipped daintily, but bathing machines? Not exactly. Italy leaned toward elegant pavilions or wooden enclosures set right on the beach. Think of them as seaside gazebos with slightly more petticoats. Open-air sea bathing was less taboo, and the concept of mixed-gender groups enjoying a splash together was, while not encouraged, not policed with the same vigor. You still weren't likely to see Aunt Margareta plunging headfirst in full view of the town square, but the sense of national panic over female ankles did not quite reach Victorian Britain's pitch. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America offered a curious blend of British tradition and its own homegrown eccentricities. Bathing machines appeared in early 19th century resorts like Cape May and Newport, especially where high society liked to summer. Some were borrowed wholesale from English designs, wooden wheels, canvas curtains, dippers included. Others, however, were more loosely interpreted, rolling tents, portable shelters, and even absurd contraptions where the machine floated and you didn't. One 1870s design proposed in Atlantic City included a machine with a retractable floor that would dunk the occupant like a tea bag, then hoist them back up. Spoiler alert, it was never approved. Perhaps the most inventive take came from Australia. Yes, they too took a stab at the bathing machine, particularly during the more puritanical late 1800s. But in a land teeming with actual sharks, stinging jellyfish, and temperatures that made flannel swimsuits a mild form of heat stroke, the enthusiasm never fully caught on. Bathers soon rebelled, forming surf clubs and demanding the right to wear, gasp, practical suits and just walk in. Back in Britain, these international perspectives occasionally made their way into travel columns or overdramatic novels. In France, one snooty 1885 magazine wrote, "Women have begun to abandon the shelter of the machine, though not always to society's benefit." That line alone was likely enough to keep a few elderly viscounts nervously clinging to their seaside sheds. Still, by the late 19th century, even in conservative British circles, awareness of how quaint and peculiar their devotion to the bathing machine had become began to grow. Tourists returning from France or Spain whispered tales of sun-dappled beaches where people simply changed behind screens. Or worse, used nothing at all but a towel and a wink. The erosion of this beloved contraption's dominance began not with a bang but with a chuckle. Because, as it turns out, it's hard to feel like the pinnacle of dignity when your privacy shed is being pulled backward into the surf by a donkey that refuses to stop for anything less than a biscuit. And besides, the continent was moving on. Dresses shortened. Beach umbrellas spread. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of laughter, free, uncovered, thoroughly scandalous, started to drown out the creaking wheels of propriety. You wake late, not quite from slumber, but from one of those half-dozes where the sun has warmed your face and the sound of seagulls has merged with the soft rustling of paper bags and the distant creak of a promenade bench. You're sprawled on a striped blanket that smells faintly of last year's mildew and overambitious lavender sachets. Nearby, the wooden bathing machines line up dutifully like aging soldiers, chipped, creaky, but proud in their own wheeled dignity. By now, your relationship with the sea bathing machine has been long and intimate. You've stepped into its damp wooden belly with courage and questionable grace, suffered the indignities of soggy bloomers and startled crabs, and even survived an accidental tide-induced voyage. But now, as the world around you begins to embrace a looser corset and a shorter hemline, the bathing machine begins to teeter on the edge of irrelevance. The first signs are subtle. You overhear a group of young women chatting near the tea cart. One of them, daring and sun-kissed, announces she'll simply wade in from the shore. No winch. No dipper. No wheeled enclosure like a mobile closet with ambition. You nearly drop your gingerbread in surprise. See, somewhere in the late 19th century, the tides, social ones, not just salt water, begin to shift. Seaside resorts are still all the rage, but the stiff choreography of modesty starts to relax. Skirts inch above the ankle. Men switch from woolen suits to more practical cotton trunks. And by the 1890s, some beaches in Britain begin to allow mixed bathing, a phrase so revolutionary at the time it's whispered with the same hush normally reserved for family scandal, or a double helping of trifle. Historians still argue whether the decline was driven more by changing fashion or changing attitudes. Some blame the French, always ready to sunbathe in scandalous proximity to strangers, for influencing English tastes. Others point to Queen Victoria's death in 1901, which seems to lift an invisible cloud of moral restraint. Either way, it's undeniable. The bathing machine starts to look old-fashioned. Like bringing a lace parasol to a rugby match. You notice it in the infrastructure too. Bathhouses with cubicles begin to pop up on shorelines. Wooden huts without wheels, scandalously stationary, offer changing rooms just a short hop from the water. And by the time the 1910s roll around, those squat little sheds on wheels are being sold off, burned, or left to become the seaside equivalent of haunted antiques. Some are converted into fishing shacks. Others become novelty tea stands or, in one documented case, a love nest for a particularly optimistic seagull couple. You spot one that's been repainted in cheerful red and white stripes and is now housing inflatable duck rings and lemonade with too much syrup. You sigh. Even nostalgia has gone commercial. But don't be fooled, there's resistance too. A few traditionalists cling to their machines like Victorian sea captains refusing to abandon ship. They argue, often loudly, that dignity is not optional and that a proper woman doesn't splash about like a haddock on holiday. You try not to laugh, but it's hard when you see one such gentleman angrily gesturing with a monocle, and then accidentally dropping it into his raspberry sherbet. Still, the world moves on. And the bathing machine, once a marvel of mobile modesty, becomes more curiosity than necessity. By the 1920s, many are gone. By the 1930s, most are forgotten. And by the time the Beatles are shouting from transistor radios, the idea of needing a portable wooden shack to access the sea is as absurd as buttering toast with a shoehorn. Yet here, in your sleepy seaside reverie, you can't help but feel a little sentimental. The bathing machine may have been ridiculous, clunky, awkward, and morally over-engineered, but it was also kind of wonderful. It spoke to a world where rules were weirdly specific, dignity was measured in fabric layers, and even the act of getting a little sunburn had to be filtered through mahogany panels and a dipper's guiding hand. So you rise, brush the biscuit crumbs from your lap, and walk past the last few machines still standing. Some are sagging. Others are being poked at by toddlers wielding plastic spades like archaeologists of the absurd. One has a sign that reads "Closed for sea repairs," which, frankly, doesn't seem promising. And yet, they endure, these gentle beasts on wheels. Not needed anymore. Not really wanted. But still somehow standing. Because sometimes things that are past their time are still worth remembering. Especially when they gave so many people a strangely beautiful way to enter the sea, with poise, privacy, and just a touch of theatrical awkwardness. You wake to the creaking of wood and the clatter of distant hooves on stone. The sun is soft now, low in the sky, warm like a pot of tea forgotten just long enough to become perfect. You're back at the beach, but the bustle is quieter. There's a sense that something's winding down. You follow the path along the shore until you see it, the last operational Victorian bathing machine, poised dramatically at the water's edge, as if it knows it's about to make history, or at least a gentle ripple in it. This isn't just any machine. She's been lovingly restored, painted a shade of pale seafoam green with tiny gold accents that glint in the light. There's bunting fluttering overhead, someone has brought a brass band, of course they did, and a small but enthusiastic crowd has assembled. Most of them are wearing wide-brimmed hats and period-appropriate mustaches, even the women, in some cases, though it may be purely coincidental. It's 1901, give or take a few interpretive liberties, and the Victorian sea bathing machine is making its official curtain call. While these modest wooden sheds won't vanish overnight, Their heyday is certainly behind them. By now, men and women are starting to test the scandalous waters of mixed bathing, and some are even, brace yourself, entering the sea without any shed at all. Decency is on the ropes. But today is ceremonial. A nod to the past. And who better to make the final dip than an elderly local woman who claims she once dipped Queen Victoria herself? Historians still argue whether this is strictly true, or whether she simply once shouted at a royal from a pier, but she's charming, nimble, and slightly terrifying, perfect for the job. You watch as she steps up to the machine, waving like royalty herself. The crowd claps politely. The horse, selected with great care from the region's more emotionally stable specimens, is attached to the front of the cart. It blinks slowly, as if unimpressed by history. With a theatrical gesture, the driver snaps the reins. The wheels turn. The bathing machine, for one final moment, trundles into the sea. You try not to get too emotional. After all, it's just a shed on wheels. But watching it float gently at the edge of the surf, curtains fluttering, sea breeze threading through its wooden slats, there's something undeniably poignant about it. Like a grandparent boarding a very slow ferry into the horizon. A small child next to you tugs on her mother's dress and whispers, "Why does she need a shed to change in?" Her mother bends down and replies very seriously, "Because otherwise you might see her elbows." Ah yes, the sacred elbows. Long a source of social peril. You smile. Meanwhile, the elderly bather completes her final dip. Two sturdy dippers, much younger, but wearing corsets in solidarity, help her down the steps and into the water. There's some cheering, a tambourine shakes, and someone lets off a small confetti cannon that is immediately confiscated by a concerned gentleman from the Historical Safety Subcommittee. When she emerges, soaking wet, grinning broadly, and trailing what might be seaweed or possibly an ambitious eel, the crowd erupts in applause. She curtsies, sneezes once, and says something about retiring to her chair with a brandy and a biscuit. The machine is hauled back onto shore for the last time. One of the wheels sticks in the wet sand. Of course it does, and for a brief moment, 6 adults and a shovel get involved. There's something poetic about that, too. Even in retirement, the bathing machine insists on one final inconvenience. And then, just like that, it's over. The machine is parked under a striped awning for photographs, eventually to be displayed in a museum where schoolchildren will poke it and ask why anyone would want to bathe in a box. But you know. You've been there, sat on its little wooden bench, felt the sea air sneak through the gaps, and heard the creak of its joints like the slow exhale of a bygone age. The curtain may be falling on the sea bathing machine, but its legacy lingers, on postcards, in seaside novels, and in the dreams of those who suspect that maybe, just maybe, things were once delightfully overcomplicated for the best of reasons. You turn away from the crowd, the salt still clinging faintly to your skin, and walk along the beach toward the horizon. Just a few more steps before the end. You walk now, barefoot in the damp morning sand, the mist curling around your ankles like a cat that's decided you might be worth following. The sea is murmuring in its sleep, lazy waves nudging at the shore with the rhythm of a very large creature that hasn't quite decided to wake up. The seagulls are unusually quiet, possibly asleep themselves, or perhaps just struck momentarily speechless by the fact that you've made it this far. You pass what remains of a bathing machine, or rather, what once was a bathing machine. A crumbling wooden wheel half buried in sand, a rusted hinge clinging to an invisible doorframe, and the ghost of a curtain flapping somewhere in your imagination. There's no sign of the bathers now. No parasols, no long skirts skimming the surf, no stern dippers barking cheerful encouragement as they helpfully hurl someone into the bracing water. Just the memory of all that movement and modesty echoing through the empty beach. You step over a forgotten pair of leather boots, children's size, you guess, and picture their owner racing toward the waves in a heavy linen suit, stopping every few feet to shriek about the temperature. It's an odd little time capsule, this shoreline. Historians still argue whether the bathing machine truly originated in Scarborough or if some earlier prototype rolled into the foam unnoticed along a different coast. What they do agree on is this: the machine served not just to protect modesty, but to reinforce a whole worldview where order, separation, and a certain kind of performative decency governed even the act of dunking oneself into seawater. It's strange, isn't it? That something so ridiculous, being wheeled into the ocean inside a little hut, was also so deeply serious to the people who did it. A matter of pride, of class, of health, and virtue, all wrapped in a curtain and tied up with string. You imagine one of those old dippers watching you now from some imaginary pier, arms folded, calling out, "Mind your ankles, love." There's decency to be upheld. You smile. You nod. You trudge on. In the distance, the last light of a long-dead seaside resort flickers in your mind's eye, striped tents, folding chairs, and the faint smell of boiled shrimp mingling with seaweed. Somewhere, a brass band struggles through a waltz while the tide continues its timeless, unimpressed advance. The machines may be gone. The rituals may be dust. But the memory lingers, odd and charming, like a seaside tune stuck in your head long after the music has stopped. Maybe next time you're at the beach, you'll look sideways at the sea and wonder what it was like to face the surf wearing 5 layers and a quiet sense of moral superiority. Or maybe you'll just enjoy the breeze, knowing some stranger once did the same from behind a striped curtain on wooden wheels. And now, the beach fades. The mist thickens, soft and gentle, curling inward like a blanket of thoughtless clouds. The wheels are gone. The machines vanished. Only the hush of the sea remains, breathing in and out like a lullaby too old to remember, too familiar to forget. You are still walking, but slower now, your footprints filling with water as soon as you leave them. The air is cooler, calmer. Your body loosens with every breath, the sand warm beneath your soles. The sun is low, but not yet setting, caught in that sweet moment of golden indecision. You let go of corsets and curtain ropes, of etiquette manuals and flannel swimsuits. You let go of donkeys and velvet beach tents, of postcards and cautious flirtations. You let go of time, and place, and even the tide. In the gentle dark, you are quiet. You are still. You are adrift in memory and moonlight, bobbing just beyond the reach of waking. Somewhere, a bell rings for tea. But not for you. Not now. You are already gone.